Hello, my name is Major General Benjamin Lincoln. Welcome to my neighborhood. I was born here in 1733. The town of Hingham, established by English settlers, was then not quite 100 years old. My parents, Elizabeth Gridley Thaxter and Benjamin Lincoln, were also born here. When I was growing up in Hingham, Lincoln Street was called Broad Cove Lane. Our family owned much of the land behind my home. People today think that Lincoln Street was named for our 16th president. However, Broad Cove Lane was renamed well before Abraham Lincoln's presidency. During the tour, you'll become acquainted with my neighbors, whose surnames may be familiar to you.
Early English immigrants began arriving here in the early 1630s. Before this time, the land we know as the town of Hingham had been the seasonal home of indigenous peoples, members of the Massachusetts tribe, a branch of the Algonquin Nation. The English settlers first called their new home Bear Cove. In 1635, the town was renamed Hingham, after Hingham, England. In 1665, the Massachusetts tribe, weakened by plague and warfare, granted the town to the settlers. The town leaders gave early settlers substantial land grants for homes, farms, and lumbering.
By the time I was born, many of their descendants had prospered and become prominent citizens. Frequently, the men in the neighborhood were selectmen, deacons, constables, representatives, and held almost hereditary town and government offices. For example, 4 generations of Benjamin Lincolns were town clerks.
The surnames of Hingham's earliest residents are familiar today as family names and on street signs. On this tour, the last names of some of Benjamin Lincoln's neighbors were Andrews, Beale, Cushing, Fearing, Hersey, Levitt, Thaxter, and Lincoln, Lincoln, Lincoln. Why so many Lincolns? In the 1630s, 8 men with the surname of Lincoln came to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and settled in Hingham. Although they were from Norfolk County, England, they were not all from the same Lincoln family. They were Daniel the husbandman Lincoln, Daniel the sergeant and the boatman Lincoln, Samuel the weaver Lincoln. Our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, was a descendant of Samuel the weaver Lincoln. Stephen Lincoln, Thomas the cooper and the maltster Lincoln. This Thomas Lincoln was Benjamin Lincoln's ancestor. Thomas the husbandman Lincoln, Thomas the miller Lincoln, Thomas the weaver Lincoln. Throughout the tour, we will mention early Hingham settlers from England whose descendants populated Benjamin Lincoln's neighborhood. Many of the structures present have been preserved, providing a setting to assist us in envisioning Lincoln Street and sections of North and South Streets in the 18th century and early 19th century. The starting point of our tour is Fountain Square, named for a water pump with a small fountain once located here. You can see the statue of Abraham Lincoln in the center of Fountain Square. While our 16th president never lived in Hingham, his ancestor Samuel Lincoln was among Hingham's first settlers. As we stand at this tribute to Abraham Lincoln today, it is important to remember that slavery was present in Hingham, as through much of New England during the colonial period. Many of the early residents whose homes are on this tour enslaved Black and indigenous people who lived and worked on some of their properties. Slavery began to die out in Massachusetts during the Revolutionary War period and was effectively abolished by a series of rulings by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, which found slavery to be inconsistent with Massachusetts' newly enacted Declaration of Rights. You can learn more about this important topic from another program in the Benjamin Lincoln World Lecture Series titled The Role of Hingham and New England in Slavery and the Triangular Trade. This is New North Church. This beautiful church, influenced by the architecture of Henry Bulfinch, was built in 1807. The congregation here was formed by families who left the first parish, known today as Old Ship, due to a controversy in 1806 surrounding the selection of a new pastor.
When Third Parish was established here, I owned Pew 7. Just up the street from the church is a two-family home at 1517 Lincoln Street, which was built in 1804 by Benjamin Beal and Joseph Hammond. Benjamin and I share common ancestors: Thomas Thaxter, a linen weaver, and Elizabeth Coffin, who arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1638. This home, which you know in the 21st century as the Old Ordinary, was built in 1686 by Thomas Andrews for his son, Thomas Andrews II. They were provided a license by the town to sell strong waters, provided they sent their patrons home at a reasonable hour and they were able to keep their legs. When I was 7 years old, Francis Barker III and his wife and my first cousin, Hannah Thaxter, purchased the Andrews home. I watched the home double in size when they added a wing to the Lincoln Street side. Hannah Thaxter Barker and I are the grandchildren of the wealthy Colonel Samuel Thaxter and Hannah Gridley. My grandparents owned the mansion at 147 North Street until my grandfather died in 1740. He left large bequests to many of his grandchildren.
In 1798, this property was sold to Ephraim Andrews, the great-grandson of Thomas Andrews II, who first held a liquor license on the property. Under Ephraim's ownership, the property became well known as Andrews Tavern and was expanded again when the roof was raised on the north side of the home and a separate public building was constructed.
This part of the neighborhood was mainly farm and pasture land when I was a boy. My contemporary Job Lincoln, born just 1 month apart from me, built both 33 Lincoln and 53 Lincoln Street for his family members. He and his wife Mercy had 9 children.
While many of Benjamin Lincoln's neighbors during this time lived surprisingly long lives, many also died young. Women often died in childbirth, and babies passed away before their first birthdays. It was not uncommon for men and women to be married more than once. Often the time between the death of a spouse and remarriage was less than a year. However, Mercy Hersey and Job Lincoln were married for 49 years before Mercy died at the age of 67. Job Lincoln was a Revolutionary War patriot. He would enlist for short periods of time, as brief as 4 to 6 days. He would simply go to Hull, perform his military duties, and return home quickly. Job lived a long life. He was 85 years of age when he died, outliving Benjamin Lincoln by 8 years.
There were 3 more houses on Lincoln Street. The house at 66 Lincoln Street was built by David Lincoln when I was 4 years old. David, a descendant of Lincolns on both sides of the family, and his wife Margaret Lincoln were Job Lincoln's grandparents. When David Lincoln died in 1756, the home was owned in succession by his son Nathan, Nathan's widow, Martha Fearing Lincoln, and her son-in-law, Barnabas Lincoln Jr. During my lifetime, the neighborhood extended to the Gill homes where Broad Cove Lane ended. The Charles Gill home was built in the late 17th century, and the Thomas Gill home was built when I was a boy. Just across the street from my house are 2 Samuel Lincoln properties, 170 and 182 North Street. The original land grant for the property at 170 North Street dates to 1635. The deed was acquired in 1649 by one of Hingham's earliest residents, Samuel the Weaver Lincoln I. This home was passed down through the family to Samuel Lincoln II, the carpenter, Samuel Boardman Lincoln III, and finally to Samuel Lincoln IV.
Samuel Boardman Lincoln III, a carpenter and sheriff by profession, married Ruth Cushing in 1714. Their 8 children included 4 sons and 4 daughters: Samuel IV, Jonathan, Seth, John, Deborah, Ruth I, Ruth II, and Ruth III. Frequently, when a child died at an early age, their siblings were named after them, as was the case with Ruth. In 1752, Ruth III married David Cushing, who commanded the 2nd Suffolk County Regiment of Militia in 1778 to 1779, during the American Revolutionary War. Samuel IV was also known as Captain Samuel Lincoln or Samuel Lincoln Jr. He was their oldest son. He lived at 207 North Street and also at 126 South Street.
Their youngest son, Captain John Lincoln, was closest to my age. John served in the early wars, was a sergeant at the Siege of Boston, lieutenant in the Rhode Island Campaign of 1779, and in 1781, commanded a company under Colonel Joseph Webb. For a short period of time around 1761, he owned the Samuel Lincoln Jr. property at 126 South Street. Now, let's have a closer look at my home on 181 North Street. The house was originally a modest dwelling, appropriate in scale and detail for a family making a living as a cooper and maltster. A later addition, now the oldest two rooms in the house, the early kitchen and a room used as my office, which was also used as a birthing room, were built prior to 1667. I married Mary Cushing on January 15, 1756 in Pembroke, Massachusetts. We had 11 children in 19 years. Mary not only raised the family, but was in charge of our farm and other businesses while I was away during the war. An amazing woman. I had a distinguished career in the Revolutionary War as a Major General in the Continental Army. Although we were defeated by the British in Charleston, South Carolina, we had 2 victories at Saratoga in 1777 and Yorktown in 1781. As General Washington's second in command at Yorktown, I accepted the surrender of the British when Cornwallis declined to attend. After the war, I served our new nation as the first Secretary of War, a delegate to the Confederation Congress, Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, Collector of the Port of Boston, and Superintendent of lighthouses, buoys, beacons, and public piers. I am delighted that in the 21st century, my home, after generations of family ownership, is becoming a house museum so that future generations can learn from our early colonial history. The house next door to mine, built in 1673, is the Israel Fearing Home. An earlier structure on this site was the first ordinary licensed in Hingham. It was owned by Nicholas Jacob, one of the first English original settlers. When I was born, the house was owned by Seth Cushing, a relative of my wife, Mary, both descendants of Deacon Matthew Cushing and Nazareth Pitcher. His wife, Lydia Hawks Fearing, is my great-aunt Lydia.
Following Seth Cushing's death, the home was owned in succession by Jediah Lincoln, William Lincoln, and Solomon Lincoln.
This part of my neighborhood includes homes owned predominantly by the Thaxters and Lincolns. Captain Samuel Lincoln, 17 years older than I am, lived at 207 North Street. Like myself, he was also a veteran of the French and Indian War. Other neighbors included Laban Hersey, whose great-grandmother was the sister of Colonel Samuel Thaxter, my grandfather. He lived on the other side of the street. My cousins, the Thaxters, grew up here at 215 North Street. The land was originally granted to Edmund Hobart shortly after the settlement of Hingham in 1635. Edmund was the brother of Peter Hobart, the first minister of Old Ship Church. 5 generations of Hobarts lived on this land, including my mother, Elizabeth Thaxter Lincoln. One of the most wonderful aspects of living in my neighborhood is that many of my neighbors are also my aunts, uncles, and cousins, with no exception here at 223 North Street. My uncle, Deacon Joseph Thaxter, and his wife, Mary Levitt, along with their 11 children, my cousins, lived here. When Deacon Joseph Thaxter died in 1808, the house at 223 North Street went to my cousin, Caleb Thaxter.
This home was built by Jonathan Lincoln in 1750. Jonathan was the son of Samuel Boardman Lincoln III and Ruth Cushing. Jonathan shares a common ancestry with Abraham Lincoln and is a direct descendant of Samuel the Weaver Lincoln, whose home we visited at 170 North Street. Jonathan married Susanna Lincoln, and together they had 12 children. Although this home is referred to today as Hersey House, it was not owned by a Hersey until it was sold in 1892 to Ira Hersey.
My neighborhood was greatly impacted by the American Revolutionary War. Jonathan Lincoln Sr. and his 5 sons served in the Continental Army. Jonathan Sr. was in my regiment, which assembled in 1775 and responded to the alarm in Lexington. I had this house built in 1794 for my daughter Hannah and her new husband Abner. Hannah was our 10th child. Abner was the son of Nathan Lincoln and Martha Fearing, who lived at 66 Lincoln Street. My son-in-law, Abner Lincoln, was appointed the first preceptor or head teacher at Derby Academy. Abner was a Harvard College graduate. He had previously taught at the town-supported school. Both Benjamin Jr. and I were trustees of the academy. All along South Street are homes that were lived in by my friends and relatives, the Lincolns, the Herseys, and the Thaxters. The house at 70 South Street was built in 1718 by my grandfather, Colonel Samuel Thaxter, a prominent and influential citizen, for his son, Farmer John Thaxter, and new daughter-in-law, Grace Stockbridge. Farmer John Thaxter became one of the wealthiest men in town with property holdings in South Hingham and ownership of several wharves in the harbor.
John Thaxter's son, also named John, became owner of the property in 1740. John II served as constable, selectman, town treasurer, and representative to the General Court of Massachusetts. In 1744, John married Anna Quincy, the daughter of John Quincy and Elizabeth Norton, the grandparents of Abigail Smith Adams, the wife of our second president, John Adams. John and Anna had 9 children, including their son, Esquire John Thaxter V, who was born in this house in 1755. He graduated from Harvard, served as Deputy Secretary to Congress, and later as Private Secretary to President John Adams. He accompanied President John Adams to the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which brought an official end to the Revolutionary War and the recognition of the United States as a sovereign nation. When Enoch Lincoln was 32, his parents, Jediah and Bethia Lincoln, moved to 185 North Street, the Israel Fearing House, next door to Benjamin Lincoln. The Major General spoke about this home earlier in the tour. Enoch then built a home at 164 North Street, across the street. You will recognize this as the home of Talbots. Enoch was a mariner, glazier, farmer, and most of all a zealous and independent Whig, the political party of John Quincy Adams and others. Enoch was a 5th-generation descendant of Samuel the Weaver Lincoln, the immigrant ancestor of Abraham Lincoln. Enoch and his first wife Rachel had 11 children, 5 daughters, and 6 sons. Their second son, Levi, was deeply involved in the founding and early years of the nation, serving as a Continental Congressman, U.S. Congressman, and Massachusetts Governor. He was the 4th U.S. Attorney General, serving from 1801 to 1805. Captain Amos, their 3rd son, participated in the Boston Tea Party when he was 20 years old. There are 5 other sons of Hingham we know of who participated in the dumping of tea into Boston Harbor in 1773. During the American Revolutionary War, Amos Lincoln became a lieutenant colonel in the Massachusetts State Artillery Regiment and served with Paul Revere. He married 2 of Paul Revere's daughters, Deborah in 1781 and later Elizabeth in 1797, shortly after the death of her sister. When Enoch Lincoln died in 1802, he was sorely missed around town. His obituary, published on June 19, 1802, in the Columbian Sentinel, read, "Enoch Lincoln, merited and obtained through a long, virtuous, and useful life the character of an honest man, and without spending time in defining terms, he gave, in his ardent, active life from the commencement of the American Revolution to its close, the best definition of patriotism. Those who knew him will remember him with great affection, while the love of our country and all that makes our country worthy in our regard has a place in their hearts. As husband and parent, his wife, his children, his children's children will cherish his memory with conjugal and filial affection, deriving consolation from the assurance of meeting him again, where pain and parting shall be no more.
During my lifetime, I participated in the French and Indian War, the American Revolutionary War, and the birth of a new nation. Political issues permeated our neighborhood, and my neighbors often held opposing viewpoints. While many of my neighbors served with me in the American Revolutionary War, some of my neighbors remained loyal to England and King George III.
Loyalists and patriots definitely lived in close proximity to one another. For example, Enoch Lincoln lived right across the street from Eliza Leavitt, a prominent Hingham Tory, who lived at 147 North Street in the Thaxter Mansion, the home of Benjamin Lincoln's grandfather.
Elijah Leavitt, who lived across the street, was one of the most powerful and wealthy Tory allies I ever encountered.
In May 1776, 1 month after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, a month before the Battle of Bunker Hill, Leavitt offered provisions including hay and cattle to British troops who dispatched 2 sloops and an armed schooner to Leavitt's Grape Island. Hearing rumors of imminent British invasion, Hingham was in an uproar, and militia from Hingham, Braintree, Weymouth, and Scituate lined the shore. When the tide was high, Hingham militia, led by Benjamin Lincoln's cousin James, crossed the harbor by boat to Grape Island, and the British withdrew. The Patriots burned Leavitt's hay and cattle and then marched to his house. Leavitt assuaged the angry group with rum and cake.
Thank you to the Hingham Historical Society for allowing me to visit my old neighborhood with you. I hope to do so again. Good day.